Very well. I think we have a quorum. Scott and Tom, are you ready?
Yes.
Yes, I'm ready.
Good. Zoe?
You're all good to go, Chip.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to go through my usual introduction. Scott, then I'll turn it over to you.
Great.
Welcome, everybody, to the Smart Policing Initiative webinar on focused deterrence and offender notification meetings. This webinar is sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance through the Smart Policing Initiative, which they have championed and supported since 2009. Thank you very much to them. CNA is hosting this webinar as one component of a range of technical assistance services provided as part of the Smart Policing Initiative. This webinar is presented by Scott Decker, a subject matter expert with the Smart Policing Initiative and professor of criminal justice at Arizona State University. Scott has a number of years of experience as an implementer and evaluator of focused deterrence and offender notification meetings through his work with strategic approaches to community safety, Project Safe Neighborhoods, and SPI. He's joined by Lieutenant Tom Woodmansee of the Madison, Wisconsin Police Department, who is also a veteran of many offender notification meetings. And he'd actually worked with a couple of our smart policing sites on their focused deterrence strategies. So please join me in thanking them for the effort they have put into delivering this webinar. I'll leave it to Scott and Tom to talk about how effective these strategies can be and how they fit into smart policing. I just need to make a few comments and then we'll hand it over to Scott and Tom. As I always remind everybody, these webinars are recorded, so please be mindful of that if you join in on the conversation. There's a couple times during the presentation where we stop and actually provide opportunity for participants to make comments or ask questions, so please feel free to do that. Please participate. Or if you want, you can participate using the chat room capability at the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a question or a comment that you want to make, feel free to post it there. At the end of this, there'll be reference to some resources that are available through Smart Policing and other organizations for learning more about focused deterrence and offender notification meetings. And we'll ask everyone to complete an evaluation form at the close of this session as well. These evaluations not only help us learn about how well these webinars are going, but they invite you to make comments and suggestions about other webinars that we might offer. So I ask you to please pay attention to that when it comes your way. With that, I'll welcome everybody again and turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Chip, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It appears that someone else has control of the slides, so I'll make a note when we ought to go to the next one. The first slide kind of lays out what Chip has already introduced. So why don't we move on to the second slide, which is the webinar outline.
Scott, you should have control of the slides. Just make sure that you're on the correct tab at the top, and then also that you've selected clicked on the slide deck to make sure that it's selected.
And which would be the correct tab at the top?
You're looking for the one that says SPI Focused Deterrence. There you go.
That's so the one I have.
Arrows.
Okay, great. So with that technical detail out of the way, just a quick review of what we hope to cover in the next 40 minutes or so, and Chip mentioned that we will certainly have ample opportunity for questions both in the middle as well as at the end, and the end is not the end, I'm fond of saying about these webinars, because both Lieutenant Woodmansee and myself are available, as are other SPI subject matter experts and the good folks at CNA, if you have questions down the road and want to follow up with those. So we're going to lay out the foundation of the approach to offender notification meetings. I know when I first broached this topic with law enforcement and prosecutors in St. Louis, they looked at me with a kind of their head cocked as if there's another crazy idea from this guy at the university, the more we talk through the foundation of what this approach means, the more they saw the logic of it and in fact became its biggest supporters. There's some problem analysis and strategies that we want to talk about that lead up to the meeting. Always important in the SPI approach to remember that we're trying to lay a good problem analysis foundation before we run ahead with our interventions. It's important, as with all interventions, that they be carefully planned and executed, and I think the offender notification meetings are particularly important in that regard. We'll talk about the meeting itself, post-meeting issues, and then we'll get to the FAQs. And you should notice in this outline that the meeting, which is sort of the highlight event, is not a small, it's an important, but it's just a part of the other steps in making for a successful offender notification meeting. We'll talk about the foundations now, and the foundations for these meetings and this targeted focused deterrence approach have a lot of support in criminal justice practice and research. You could go back earlier, but certainly starting with Boston ceasefire in the early and mid-1990s, we understand the role of focused deterrence, and I think really important to understand as we move ahead that problem analysis and looking at data not just once but on a repeated basis was a real foundation to what made the Boston Gun Project a success. And we sometimes, in our problem analysis, I think we sometimes strive to create a big, perfect, grand explanation of all things that ever occurred. And really, Boston had just a couple key points that guided their interventions and emerged from the problem analysis, specifically that there was a small group of youths involved in gangs and street crews who were responsible for almost all the homicides and shootings that involved youth. So if we're going to make any difference at all, that's a group we got to keep focused on. And we all know that once an intervention gets started, it's easy to get distracted and to look at the bright shining light over in the corner or the new homicide in a different part of town. But staying focused on that key set of findings, really important and, of course, not easy to do. Most of the people in that small group of youth in Boston had extensive criminal justice histories, and those criminal justice histories almost always had a current status, which is to say, as one of the lieutenants involved in the initial Boston project said, we could reach out and put a hand on them. They were on probation. They were on parole. They had outstanding warrants. They were a prohibited person from carrying a gun, so that if they were stopped and had a gun in their possession, we were able to take steps to intervene with them. And that putting a hand on them, I think, is really an important concept to keep in mind. And it may not be that what was true in Boston is true in your city. Maybe the magnitude is different. Maybe the problem is more dispersed. Maybe it's of a different nature. Maybe it's drug sellers rather than people engaged in youth gangs. But I think the key point and the key takeaway for me is important to identify the high-risk groups, how we can get a hand on them, and then design the intervention from there. The offender notification meetings came about as a way to directly communicate with the at-risk population. We all engage in general deterrence. We announce there's going to be a crackdown. We run ads, get tough on crime. We stand up at neighborhood meetings and talk about those things. But the offender notification meetings are a way of putting those highest of the high risk on notice directly in ways that takes away their anonymity, that we're looking at them, we can reach out and touch them, and that we're going to pay increased attention to them. And that direct communication is something that the meeting does and does very well. Most sites that have done offender notification meetings have discovered that there really are two groups. There's the A-listers and the B-listers. The A-listers are those people who are at highest risk for immediate engagement in violent and serious crime. So we know that their record, their past, their experience puts them at high risk because they've done it before. The B-listers are people who we think are headed in that direction, but maybe we can do some things to keep them from going all the way into graduating, if you will, to the A list. And the distinction between A and B lists is important and useful, I think, in part because the frustration that we all feel when we do warrant sweeps, or we serve a large number of arrest warrants, or we go scoop up high-rate offenders in a neighborhood, we take down the neighborhood drug dealers. It seems like there's a line that goes on forever of mostly young men who are willing to step into the positions of the guys we've just arrested and taken off the street. That's where the B-listers come from. Offender notification meetings allow us to do something about B-listers. In order to be successful, there are a number of key elements that have to be present in an offender notification meeting, problem analysis being one we've already identified. There has to be a strong law enforcement presence. When I get a call from communities who want to try offender notification meetings, they say, yeah, we really want to do it, but the police aren't on board. Well, my response to that is you better get the police on board, or you're probably not going to be very successful. And just as there needs to be strong law enforcement support, there also needs to be strong social support. That if this is only a message about the stick, that is increased penalties, not likely to be very successful. There has to be a carrot, some offer of support, whether it's jobs or drug treatment or access to services or job training. There needs to be involvement in the community. More about that later. It may be the most sensitive and difficult and important part for offender notification meetings that plays on their sustainment. We've got to communicate in a direct and forthright way. These guys know when we're lying to them. These guys know when we're handing them a load of BS. So we got to be direct, honest, and forthright. And then there needs to be follow-up. I'm going to talk about each of those components a little bit, but I want to highlight the role of social support. It can come from a variety of groups. Certainly family members are key to resolving the issues that many offenders have. Their families can provide support, they can provide deterrence, they can provide shaming, they can provide the kind of conduit to get A and B listers involved. Neighbors can speak powerfully to the damage that crime and victimization do in their neighborhoods and do to people. And there's also a role for community elders, those respected individuals who've been in the community for a while. Maybe they had some involvement in crime in their past and have moved past that, but they can play an important role in bringing reality to the A and B listers in a way that sometimes others of us can't. Pastors, where they're involved and willing to be involved. Schools are all other groups that can play a role. Now, let's move on to the second of the key elements in the outline, and that's the problem analysis, the strategies, and the meetings. And we start with what the research tells us, which is where smart policing initiatives should always start if they're going to be successful and they're going to be sustainable. In Boston, the research tells us that the offender notification meetings, in conjunction with other approaches, produced rather dramatic and sustained declines in youth homicides, and just as importantly, once their eye came off the ball and once the focus moved away from what they were doing to be successful, those homicide rates, those youth homicide rates, came up again. So, in addition to Boston, we know that a number of sites, and Chip mentioned the tongue twister that he and I were involved in earlier, Strategic Approaches to Community Safety Initiative, Project Safe Neighborhoods, which was in 94 U.S. attorney districts, the High Point experiment, have all produced positive results from over a dozen communities. So this isn't a one-shot deal where we got lucky with it in one community. It's been replicated in a number of communities, and it's proven to be a rather versatile intervention, which is to say that it's been used successfully against a variety of problems: gun crime, violent crime, drug dealing, offenses by probationers and parolees. And so I think you can look at the O&M as a way to address a variety of different kinds of serious crime problems in the community. And I think that, we often, if we're from a smaller jurisdiction, say, oh, well, we're not Boston, we're not Chicago, we're High Point, we're a smaller community. And there's evidence from focused deterrence research and offender notification in particular that declines can occur in smaller communities with different crime problems as well. This Indianapolis is the graph that we have up here. In every case, homicide risk declined following the intervention, which included rather extensive, and I should say rather graphic, offender notification meetings that were held in a courtroom, and I'll mention a little more detail about that in a bit. One of the reasons that we believe that offender notification meetings work and produce successful results is they influence a social network. And this rather simple but I think powerful graphic that's up now shows how to select call-in attendees. It also demonstrates that offenders are linked to each other in a variety of ways. And if we can find the key players, if you will, and influence their behavior, take them out of criminal networks, those networks are changed. And if we make sure that when we, especially if our focus is on A-listers, when we design the call-ins, and we are sure to include the key A-listers, then many of those networks will fall apart, and we don't have this chain replacement problem where one guy's standing in line to replace the other guy who got arrested. So why do they seem to have an impact? Well, we have pretty good research and some practice experience to depend on that tells us that, A, we target a highly focused, at-risk population. We're not picking the low-hanging fruit, the occasional offenders. We're looking for the high-risk guys. Two, and I think this is really critical, and it's something that's done throughout the entire offender notification process, and that is a real key goal is to reduce anonymity. There's nothing that's more effective than when a prosecutor or a police chief at an offender notification meeting walks up to an offender and says, "John Jones, we know that last night you were at so-and-so's bar, or we know you weren't home when curfew check was done. We know you got 6 months more on parole." Really gets an offender's attention when that personal message can be delivered. The message is also specifically delivered to those who need to hear it the most. It influences a social network, the offender notification meetings do, and it has to be perceived as fair. Large body of research that shows when active offenders perceive interventions to be unfair or biased, they aren't very much affected by them. And so the offender notification meeting does produce a level of fairness and a perception that we're not just here to arrest you, we're also here to help you out with jobs or social services or family, although if you continue to offend, we will arrest you. And there's also a level of community support. And the two pictures on the slide, I think, graphically demonstrate one of the things that's made law enforcement somewhat more effective over the course of the last 2 decades, and that's more engagement with the community, learning from, listening to the community, and encouraging and engaging the community's voice in ways that really demonstrates the harm that offenses do to the community. And I think, the role of young people is particularly important there. One of the hard things to do is to link the problem analysis to an offender notification meeting in a way to enhance individual accountability. A lot of that has to do with what your problem analysis leads you to as your key problem. It can be group-based networks or gangs, it can be illegal gun carrying, it can be inmate reentry, it can be probation offending, and there are other new emerging applications. People are using it to deal with other specialized types of crime, whether it's juvenile offenders, whether it's recently released individuals from prison, as they did quite successfully in Chicago. But I think that the goal here, and the next slide documents that goal, is that we're in a...
To unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
What happened?
Scott, are you still on the line?
I am. Hello?
Getting the audio again?
Hello?
Hi, Scott. I can hear you. Tom,
Okay.
Are you also on the line?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. I think we're okay. I think that there's just a glitch in the audio, and all the audio lines were just separated from the call-ins.
Okay.
But is our audience still on the line? Can a few of you speak up?
I am Kim Mitchell.
Yes.
Okay, I think, Scott, you can probably just keep going.
All right, we'll plow through. One of the goals of smart policing is continuous quality improvement. We continue to assess what we're doing, its impact, how to make it better, and the slide that's up on the screen now illustrates the loop that, well, it may start with problem analysis that leads to a strategy and careful planning on implementation, then assessment and feedback. We don't declare victory and go home and put our feet up on our desk, because we know that offenders will adapt and there'll be additional issues to address. And I really like the slide because it illustrates the importance of keeping up with our problem analysis, our strategy, and continuously fine-tuning things. Well, the goal in group-based offender notification meetings is to prosecute the most violent individuals, calling their associates in order to prevent the backfill of lower-level players. We talked about that replacement chain problem earlier. Many communities are faced with and plagued by retaliatory violence, and that's a key goal of preventing in offender notification meetings, whether it's reducing gun carrying, but in particular, the last point, reducing anonymity. When offenders walk in the room and they see their probation officer, they see officers that walk the beat in their neighborhood, their parents are there, their pastor's there, that really disrupts their comfort zone. And that's one of the goals of an offender notification meeting. We want to disrupt criminal networks by taking out key players, A-listers, people whom networks depend upon, and create alternative pressures on the group. And that's where the role of the community, the family, the elders, and neighbors can come in. We'll sum up this part of the presentation and note, what we saw in the loop, that we start with the problem analysis, we get A-listers and B-listers identified, we engage the community, and only then do we conduct the calling. We want to avoid the ready, fire, aim syndrome that we're plagued with too often. And then following that, we conduct a follow-up. Kind of how did we do? What can we do better? A number of steps in planning and executing the meetings, and I would say that your success will be dependent upon how carefully you would pay attention to and execute this slide. Much of the work occurs before the meeting. Identifying the call-in candidates is really important. You don't want a room mixed with low-rate and high-rate offenders. You want to make sure that the offenders you've identified for the meeting are linked carefully to your problem analysis, so you identify who they are. You then provide an invitation, and we might want to put invitation in quotation marks. This is an invitation with teeth. This is an invitation that says you will attend. Sometimes those invitations come from police chiefs, sometimes they come from probation officers, sometimes they come jointly from law enforcement and social service people. We want to make sure that influentials are there. The offender notification meeting doesn't work when all it is the same police and prosecutor who've been telling offenders for years, this time we're serious, and we're going to go after you with everything we've got. We need to make sure that influentials in the community who can speak and say, your crimes hurt our families, your crimes hurt our community, your crime hurt our people, our culture, that the community engagement can deliver that. And the setting is important as well. Do we hold them in a church? I've been to a number of ONMs in churches. I've been in a number of them in police departments, probation offices, courtrooms, community centers, but that's something that has to be decided individually. And then there's the message and the follow-up. Identifying the call-in candidates has to be based on problem analysis. Gun crime, gang crime, crime by parolees, probationers, drug sales. Once we identify our key problem, we can identify the call-in candidates. And we can build that base of knowledge both from crime information systems, whether it's CAD or RMS, that give us hotspots or high-risk offenders, or street-level intelligence, gang or drug unit or violent crime unit officers or CID unit officers who know, here's the 6 or 8 guys who are really driving us crazy. We can't get a handle on them. We employ the levers, that reaching out and touching them, probation, parole, warrants, establishing criteria for the A and B list. We can engage in systematic case review, and there's a good strategic guide for doing case review from Project Safe Neighborhoods that's an SPI resource up on the website, and then paying attention to process. The invitation, or as I think we like to sometimes call it, the order, can identify probation or parole status. It can talk about drug offenders, family members, or it can be, as the following slide demonstrates, a letter from the chief of the police department. And this is from Chief Feely in High Point, and it lays out, I'm the chief, I'm writing to tell you by name, again, reducing anonymity, we're paying attention to you, we need you to be at the meeting, we're not going to arrest you there, this is not a trick. And I think it's a good letter because it produced very high rates of attendance. Who are the influentials? Well, they can be members of informal social networks, family members, a moral voice close to an offender. It could be a teacher at school. It could be a coach. It could be someone they used to offend with who's gone straight. But it can also be somebody whose support we enlist to help us provide additional levels of both surveillance and support. The message is, we're looking at you, we're paying careful attention to you, and we want you to succeed. We can identify those influentials in a variety of ways. We can create teams, but again, the goal ought to be increased surveillance, reduced anonymity, and increased accountability. Community engagement has shown variation, as it should, from O&M site to O&M site, depending upon what the nature of the crime analysis shows, but also the resources that are available at the local community level. It's a chance for people in the criminal justice system to kind of reach out and say, here's some support, and it's also a chance for community members and social service members to say, if you don't take advantage of our services, you will be arrested, you will go to prison or jail, you will have your parole revoked. So it's an interesting mixture of both supports and enforcement. I'd like to turn it over now to our guest presenter, who's got extensive experience, Lieutenant Tom Woodmansee from the Madison Police Department. Tom, I'll let you pick it up from here.
Okay, thank you, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity to share our information with everyone, and I just want to give a little background from my world. I've been an officer for 23 years and had a wider range of array of experiences, from being an undercover officer to a detective. I was on the SWAT team for 15 years as both a tactical operator and a negotiator, and later went on to be the lieutenant of the SWAT team and be part of training prior to heading the unit that I do now. And I only tell you my background because I'm so excited about what focused deterrence is about, and I've never felt a more rewarding and impactful experience than what I'm involved with now with the model that we have. What I would start with is to say that what Scott has outlined is about the preparation and the pre-work is so critical. In 2010, Chief Ray, our chief at the time, tasked me with developing our unit designed to go after repeat violent offenders, to try and better address the problems that they have on the disproportionate amount of crime in our community. So I researched, with the help of another detective, 20-plus agencies to find out what the best models were, and we really saw that the focused deterrence model stood out. So we designed and developed our model, and what we did was we really involved a lot of other partners in this model and its development, the people that were really needed for it, all the way from community members to law enforcement partners to Professor Mike Scott, Herman Goldstein from Problem Oriented Policing Center, and it really was a well thought out process before implementation. So I'd also recommend strongly that if you're considering this and wishing to start, come up with an outline, and I'd be happy to help anyone with what we did. I came up and wrote a 13-page document that describes the mission and the structure of how our approach is going to be. So currently what I am involved with is I supervise 5 dedicated detectives and 1 intelligence officer who are assigned purely to our focused deterrence program. That is all that they do. I also supervise our gang unit, which is a nice connection to have because a lot of the offenders in our program have gang history, and our gang unit actually implements a focused deterrence approach as well. So the logistics, the planning, and the evolving of the partners, the orchestrating of pre-implementation is critical. What I did was I met with every agency head that I knew was pivotal for this to start and be successful. So I sat down with the U.S. Attorney, the District Attorney, the head of Department of Corrections, our FBI, our ATF, our DEA, our state police, and I also included local chiefs in our regions, and I just did a group meeting and told them what we were intending to do and wanted to know their level of involvement. This was critical, and especially with Department of Corrections being involved. We also identified key providers in the community that would offer resource and assistance to our offenders, and we used United Way as our first contact point. And they were the ones who arranged for the connection with education, housing, mental health, and substance abuse, et cetera. So I mention this just because you can't go into a new approach like this believing that it'll just launch without a lot of planning. And you'll get resistance. You'll get some people questioning the approach. But as Scott mentioned, this has been proven in multiple communities to be successful. And I think Madison is just an example of where we're really seeing some positive results. And I'll talk about that later in my second portion, Scott. So thank you.
Great. We'll move on then to the stop and think, our first stop and think of the presentation. If there are people out there who have used this strategy, we could ask them to chime in and talk a little bit about how their department has used problem analysis to develop offender notification meetings, and then the strategies that were used for planning and executing them. Do we have a jurisdiction? I could always go back to Tom, who I know has done this and done it well in a number of settings, to talk a little bit about these. But are there members of the webinar out there who have participated and done these? Well, Lieutenant, could you weigh in perhaps?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think part of the message I want to convey as well is you've already touched on, Scott, is this application can be utilized in a wide variety of communities and agencies. And what we did was we did our problem analysis, and I supervised our crime analyst team as well. And we came up with our idea for what was impacting our community for safety was repeat violent offenders. So we started with wanting, as you've heard already, the ability to pull levers, and we identified the most prolific repeat violent offenders on supervision in our community. And the detectives that I supervise will tell you that it is remarkable when you actually spend a significant amount of time analyzing and studying an individual who's been in and out of the criminal justice system so many times. It is remarkable as to where something is clearly identified as not working, not having an impact. So what we did for our analysis was to really hone in on those people that we felt were in and out of the system and having the most significant impact on victims in our community. So that was what we started with. And tell me, Scott, if you want me to go into our selection process now or wait till later, I'd be happy to at any point.
Great. Maybe we'll move on and leave that for down the road in the interest of time. We'll talk about the meeting now. Where you hold these is important. This is not something we do on a regular basis as a community or in the criminal justice system. Most commonly, the meetings have been held in police departments, community centers, schools. I've been in more church basements recently for offender notification meetings than I can recall, but also in courtrooms. I know in Indianapolis they'd regularly hold the meetings in the courtroom, and they'd have, if an individual had been arrested, they would have their name on a chair with the date they were arrested and what jail or prison they were in. If they had been shot or killed, there was an RIP, a gravestone, if you will, put on the chair with their name. It was a pretty graphic way to convey the significance and seriousness and consequences of the behavior individuals were engaged in. Planning for the meeting is really important. The order is important as well, and typically it's gone law enforcement, then community/social support, or it's alternated back and forth. But nothing gets the attention of a group of offenders and their family, where their family's invited, like the message from the U.S. Attorney talking about federal prison sentences and the high percent of individuals who are found guilty and how much of their time they do, and they do it far away. It's a pretty sobering way to start out the evening, but one that needs to be balanced by social service discussions as well. For law enforcement and criminal justice officials, probation, parole, prosecutors, there needs to be a clear, simple, and direct message, and that message is criminal behavior must stop, period. We're watching you. You're going to be identified. You've already been identified. We're going to be paying careful attention to you. And the message needs to be delivered in a pretty direct way using examples. I've seen prosecutors talk about, I saw a U.S. attorney talk about putting the father and the grandfather of an individual in the room who'd been called in federal prison. And he walked over and stood next to the young offender and said, I don't want to be the one that puts the third generation of your family in federal prison. I will. It won't make me happy, but let's see if we can't prevent that from happening. It was a pretty powerful moment in the room. People perked up and paid attention, and that young man's mother, whose husband was in federal prison, took a special interest in her son after that U.S. attorney came over and spoke to her son. You know, you need to talk about the people who didn't pay attention. I talked about posters of those who've been shot, killed, incarcerated. Reducing anonymity is an important part of that message that's delivered by law enforcement, but also group accountability. We all know that when retaliation goes on back and forth between groups, they don't always get the guy who did the initial shooting or the guy who did the retaliatory shooting. Anybody in the group is fine. Well, that needs to end, and individuals need to know that if their group retaliates, everybody will be held responsible. The community message is important. It too needs to be delivered in an unequivocal, direct, and personalized way, and that message needs to be clear that people in the community are tired of whether it's violence, drug dealing, offending, disorder. It's disrupting the community. It's hurting children. It's wrong. Someone needs to stand up from the community and express moral outrage, but balance that with the notion that people in the community want the individuals in the room to know that they should be part of the group, part of the community, part of law-abiding communities and neighborhoods. There'll be help, but if they choose not to listen, the community will work with law enforcement to see that law enforcement does its job of arrest and prosecution successfully. Social services are important, whether it's drug treatment services, job training, job readiness, or jobs. That needs to be a positive message, and it needs to be a realistic message. Many offenders don't have the training, experience, or background to do a lot in the job market beyond hourly minimum wage jobs, at least to start. So promising careers and good jobs is often difficult to do. Promising a stepladder that can move from minimum wage to better paying jobs with training and with progress is something that can be done. The key message here is to provide opportunities. But regardless of who delivers the message, there are two really key points. One is to be credible with threats. Don't promise you're going to arrest everybody in town who deals or possesses drugs, because you're not going to do that. And offenders know you can't deliver on that. But offenders also know you can't promise everybody a job with benefits that will allow them to buy a house and cars and support their family, at least not initially. So you need to be credible, and you need to promise only things that you can deliver. Well, we've mentioned earlier that we've learned a good deal from prior research and prior experience in doing offender notification meetings. We know that multiple voices are important. The police chief and a prosecutor or U.S. attorney, their presence is critical because it conveys to the group that we really mean business. Neighborhood leaders, crime victims, faith-based leaders also are important. Really powerful messages have been delivered by ex-offenders, whether they're a former gang member or somebody who's reached that age, mid-40s, early 50s, where offenders often straighten around and kind of see the light and don't want to, I know from hearing a lot of ex-offenders talk, they don't want to die in prison, and they know if they get that third strike, they're going to be in their 50s or 60s when they come out. Coordinators of social services, employment, job training coordinators, and people need to be prepared before they talk. The worst thing to have is somebody who gets up there, and I've seen police captains and I've seen community members go on and on and on, and everybody's looking at their watch and wishing they'd be done. Short, sharp, direct, 3 to 5 minute talks are the most effective, and they need to stay on script, and they need to rehearse. One of the things we know about public speaking is that practice makes better, and more practice makes perfect. There's a lot of issues following the meeting that have to be attended to. Meetings ought to go an hour, really no more than an hour and 15, tops an hour and a half. And after the meeting, there needs to be individual follow-up. If social service agencies are going to staff cases and provide resources, referrals, and follow-up, they need to do that in a relatively quick basis. If it goes a month, then offenders and their families are likely to say, well, here's more of the same. They're promising stuff that isn't going to happen. Some sites hold individualized meetings at the end of an offender notification meeting or the next day. I've seen offender notification meetings that go from the law enforcement to the social service to the community to questions right into job training. And so that all the offenders left that meeting that night with a resume. Many of them didn't have a resume that they could use to apply for jobs. And producing 20 or 30 copies of their resume that they could take home and then deliver to jobs they applied for and get a business card or some evidence that they had actually applied for a job was a really useful way to demonstrate that we were serious, we were going to deliver, but also to hold offenders accountable. And there are some sites that will hold a follow-up meeting a week or two later to make sure that offenders know that this isn't a one-shot deal, that we're not going to deliver the message and go away. Well, all good programs need maintenance. They need checkups. It can take the form of needs assessment or referral. It can take the form of case management, skill building, job referrals. Again, we know many offenders are not ready to enter the job market successfully. We could get them a job, but unless they have some job preparedness training, the likelihood of them doing very well is not too high. And we also know that they need to remain crime-free. I've seen mothers approach precinct captains and prosecutors at the end of O&Ms and say, I want to know if he gets in trouble again. I'm going to work with him. I'm going to keep an eye on him. I'm your ally. Let me know. I'll be a help to you. And that additional set of hands and eyes and ears can be very useful. There needs to be a community level follow-up as well. Certainly for law enforcement, to let the community know that we're serious about a new way of doing business, and that can include a variety of lever-pulling activities, whether it's knock and talks, going back to the houses of individuals who were at the call-out, the offender notification meeting, reminding them, we got an eye on you, we're paying attention, how are things going. It can be directed patrol in neighborhoods, additional drug screens, drug drops, probation, parole, home visits, warrant service and the like, gang injunctions. Again, all ways to reduce anonymity and to let offenders know we got a hand on you, we're looking out for you, and we're looking out for what you're doing to the community. Now, community engagement is another important thing, and oftentimes the activities of community engagement are symbolic, and we know that, a march and a cleanup and block watch are not going to solve all our crime problems, but they are going to raise awareness, and that's a key thing we can do with the community. There can be cleanups. Landlord education has been an important project that's helped many communities deal with the underlying problems that lead to crime, and that can be done through code enforcement, nuisance abatement. It's important too that we face a lot of challenges, and we have a lot of failure in our efforts to make communities safer. When we do have success, we ought to celebrate it. We ought to be forthright about that, and we ought to look for unanticipated partners. It's often the case that local businesses have a lot to gain from increased public safety. And my colleague at CNA, Chip Stewart, made this point a week or two ago, that local business owners need to be shown and encouraged to participate. And what do they get out of it? Well, in neighborhoods with reduced crime, clearly there's more business. Their business does better. They're safer communities. People are more likely to come in shop. They're more likely to be in neighborhoods where those business owners are trying to run a successful business, whether it's a shop or a restaurant, a store, or whether it's renting apartments or renting houses or running services. So they can be a partner in our efforts, particularly where community safety can be enhanced. I'm going to flip it back to our guest speaker, Lieutenant Woodmansee, who's going to describe the Madison model, a successful model that's been going for a while and implemented there and now kind of taken to scale in other communities. Tom, if you would, please.
Okay, thank you again. One thing I'll comment on from what we're learning here and people that I work with is people are really starting to embrace what this is all about, because we're holding offenders accountable for when they reoffend, because we have a district attorney and a U.S. attorney who are committed to no plea bargains if they reoffend. Yet at the same time, we're seeing some of the offenders in our program take advantage of the help that's being offered and are actually doing really well. Our goal is to reduce the number of victims in our community. What I want to just touch on is how we choose who we notify. We actually have what's called a selection committee in place that's comprised of prosecutors from both state and federal level. We have federal and state corrections supervisors. We have citizens from our community. We have resource advocates. We have ex-offenders on this committee. And we have a rotating police captain from our department. So our detectives will do extensive backgrounds on hundreds and hundreds of viable offenders who are deemed to need this intervention, this notification. We whittle it down to about 30, and then this committee reviews blindly. They review the histories of the offenders. We present them with candidate numbers, candidate number 1, and we go through each history. So we don't identify their name, we don't identify their race, and this independent committee selects who's to be notified. We found this has been very beneficial for when the media first was scrutinizing us and suggesting that this was a group of cops going after African Americans. It dispelled that, and even the judges have, during sentencing, have refuted the claims that this was biased because of the blind selection process. As Scott talked about, the delivery, the invitation, quote unquote, is so pivotal. What we do is we hand deliver letters from the head of the Department of Corrections to the participants in the notification. We really want to ensure that they come. That's the most important thing. And thus far, what we're finding is that we've had good success. All but 2 that we've asked or mandated to come have come. So that's positive for us. We hold our notification at a non-governmental building at the United Way. And currently we have 14 members on our law enforcement panel, including the chief, the U.S. attorney, the district attorney, and all the head agencies of all law enforcement that we can find. Also, am I still on? You guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. We have 20 members of our community that also participate in our notification. We strive for consistent messages, both from community members who provide a moral voice, our resource advocates, and law enforcement. Your violence will no longer be tolerated, yet we want you to succeed. That is a consistent theme throughout our notification meeting. Our U.S. Attorney will hold up 2 documents to the offenders who we are notifying, and we sit them right directly in front of the panel. They are less than 4 feet away from this panel of high-powered law enforcement members. The U.S. Attorney will say, you can have 2 pieces of paper here. The first one is an indictment, and I can name the guy who sat in your chair for the first notification that we had who's currently doing 15 years in prison for selling drugs. He didn't listen. The second document is what we give out to you after a year of not committing violent crimes. We call it an anniversary letter. It's signed by the U.S. Attorney, it's signed by the Chief of Police, the Head of Department of Corrections, and the District Attorney. So our detectives will actually deliver these anniversary letters to the offenders, and it's quite a powerful and emotional thing for them. One of the offenders recently told us he couldn't go 2 months without being arrested, so he took great pride in receiving such a letter. Our sheriff as Scott mentioned, our sheriff at our notifications tells them that all 500 of his employees will now know who you are. We are stripping your anonymity. The most powerful thing that I think I've seen in our notifications, the last one we did, we actually had 2 previously notified offenders sit down in front of the new group and say, look, just knock it off. I get what you're feeling. I sat in your chair before. It's time to man up. It's time to own who you are and stop your violence. We're doing it. It works. They mean what they say. That was really nice and powerful to see. And here at Madison, with the unit that I supervise, what we do is somewhat unique as far as I'm aware, and I really think it's impactful. We assign a detective to every notified offender. So they leave that notification knowing that they're assigned direct monitoring by one of the members of our Special Investigations Unit. But these detectives not only monitor for acts of violence and crime, they also offer support and make sure that they know what the program really is about. So a week after the notification, we'll knock on their door, we'll explain to them what it was that they went through, and we'll tell them that this is really an opportunity because they should look at it as that. But we'll also remind them that there are people who've been notified before doing extensive time in prison who otherwise wouldn't have been doing that time in prison without this extra attention. One of our notified offenders is currently serving 13 years in prison for a misdemeanor, which our district attorney said there'll be no plea, and it's fairly unheard of here in the county I reside in. But the judge cited that he chose not to take advantage of the opportunities, and he committed further acts of domestic abuse. So we get to know the families, we get to know the associates, we get to know a lot about these individual offenders. I'm not saying that all of you would have to do that with your model. I'm just saying that this to us is a continuous reinforcement of support and accountability. I think it's important to just highlight some of what the statistics we're seeing so far are, as we're seeing some promising results. We have 54 offenders who've been notified in our program, and they average 31 criminal charges each. Each averages 7 felonies, and each averages 9 independent victims of crime. So that's 356 felonies and 499 independent victims of crime. And over 80% of our offenders have weapon histories, one way or another, involved in shootings, homicides, armed robberies. Now, post-notification, and these numbers are going to change, but right now, we've had 9 returned to prison on new charges. We have no new weapons violations or information that they've been involved in shootings or robberies, which is fairly remarkable given the population. And most importantly, we have 8 new victims of violent crime, and most of those are domestic abuse, which we're finding is a constant theme. So we're seeing positive results. We're seeing fewer arrests being made with this population, fewer impact on resources in the police department and the community. And I'll just end by talking about a couple of the lessons learned that I think it's important. And I'll incorporate some of the consult I did with my CNA visits on site. I would advocate strongly that you clearly define what your model and your model's mission is and don't deviate from that. It's very important, especially since I mentioned before, people won't completely understand what this is, so you're going to have to do a lot of education. You're going to really have to tell them that this is just a little different way of doing things, even though it's based on common sense, in my opinion. Identify the key stakeholders and get their buy-in, as I mentioned before, and their support. What I learned from my visit in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was they struggled a little bit with getting the invitation out, and they had a less than desired number of offenders show up. So what I suggested, and I think they're going to implement, is actually going out and doing the hand-in-person invitations with one of the group that was notified originally to tell them that this is an opportunity for them as well. You want to make sure to do what I think Kansas City does a great job as, is really define at the introduction of the notification what this is. Here's what it is about, so that they understand what they're there for, and they have a clear understanding that from this day forward, everything is different in their lives. They're going to be monitored differently. Scott talked about this, and I'll just echo it again, the time constraints and scripted out. I wrote the scripts for all the panel members in the first few notifications before they became comfortable with it, so I highly recommend that, and I'd be happy to provide any of my scripts to them. I'm sorry, to you. And also, don't have too many voices. That can dilute the message to some degree. So I'll just close by saying I really want to express how much I think this is a remarkable opportunity for any agency and community. Madison, we average less than 10 homicides a year. Kansas City, I think last year had 114 homicides. And we're both implementing this kind of approach, and we're both seeing positive results, or at least the potential for some really positive results. And for me, the most important information I can tell you is that we have had offenders in the program, whether through our intelligence gathering or monitoring, indicate that they were going to commit violent acts of crime, whether one was a home invasion, another was armed robberies, and they said they weren't going to do it now because they're in this program. So we really strive to make our model not just a police-driven model, but this is owned by the community, and the police assist with it. So that's what I have for now, Scott.
Thank you, Tom, very much. And I think you get a sense of some of the excitement about this as an intervention because of its ability to do what we all would like to do more of in criminal justice, and that is identify that small number of very high-rate offenders and do something with and to and for and about them. We all have the sense that there is a relatively small, one of the criminological facts that we know is a relatively small group of individuals commit a large volume of crime. In order for us to bring crime down, particularly working in an efficient way, we need to identify them and change their behavior. And that's exactly what an offender notification meeting is meant to do. So we will move now to the stop and thinks. And the stop and thinks include some of the challenges or lessons learned. Clearly, problem analysis has to be front and center, careful planning. I really like the fact that Lieutenant Woodmansee wrote out the scripts for everybody who was involved. And frankly, when I've seen that done, the people who are the presenters, they're grateful to have someone else kind of take care of that for them. And then the post-meeting engagement can really produce an extra benefit from the meeting themselves. And thinking about how you might do that, I think, is really critical. And I know we're bumping up against time here. I want to go through the FAQs, kind of highlight what I think are some of the important ones, and then if there are questions from people on the line, leave them the chance to ask them, as well as to remind people that the webinar will be stored through some magic technological means on the SPI website. It'll be available to be heard, and I know I speak for the lieutenant as well as myself in that we're certainly happy and willing to respond to questions. Well, the first question is, are these guys going to show up? And the answer across almost all the sites is yes. The majority of them do show up. The more methods we use to deliver the invitation, in-person, letter, family member, influentials, the more likely they are to show up. Clearly, we need to be prepared for an unruly attendee. The assistant U.S. attorney I worked with in St. Louis had a somewhat different name to describe unruly attendees. You can use your imagination to come up with what it might have been, but we've got to be prepared to deal with them. Someone needs to speak up. Someone needs to be the designated unruly attendee dealer with her, which is to say, quite often it's a police officer whose job it is to say, look, we're only here to give information. We're not here to engage in a dialogue or a debate or a discussion. And somebody has to be ready, if it comes to it, to walk them out of the room and say, look, we're sorry, you had your chance. This isn't what the meeting's about, and we'll be seeing you in the precinct house or the station house. Who gets invited? Who gets prosecuted? Another important question. But again, problem analysis, local understanding of the problem are all the basis and foundation for making these decisions about who gets invited, who on the A-list gets prosecuted. Some jurisdictions have said, if you use a gun in a crime, we're going to prosecute you. We got zero tolerance. Others, like Madison, have said, we're going to give you a chance at the call-in. But those are things that need to be determined and known in advance. And it also needs to be determined about what it will take to get prosecuted by an individual who comes to a meeting and isn't successful. Do we have zero tolerance for the people who attend the ONMs, or do they get a little bit of slack? In addition, critical to know what we promise them. If we say, you carry a gun and we catch you, you're going away to prison, we better be ready to back that up. We better be ready not to plea bargain, to throw resources at those cases. And clearly we're not going to prosecute everybody for every minor law violation. We all know the expensive resource that the criminal justice system is, and that it's more effective when used as a precise instrument rather than a blunt weapon. So being honest about what we're going to do and couching it in terms that are honest and forthright, but also offer some hope to these guys. I think the story about the offenders in Madison who are proud to get the letter that they've gone a month crime-free and that there are crimes that they would have committed, I mean, these are important not just for the offender themselves, but for the community. There's a victim out there who was going to be a victim of a horrible crime. A home invasion is a horrible crime. It stays with victims for a long time, and if we prevent those as has been done in Madison, that's a real win for the community. That's something that we can tangibly offer to the community as progress, and without being too over the top, it makes the quality of life better. For most sites, the level of security has been heavy law enforcement presence, officers at the doors. It conveys a serious tone to the meeting, but there are also sites that have used metal detectors. If you hold your meeting in a courtroom, you're going to use them. There are going to be metal detectors that are going to be used. And in Indianapolis, they did that, and it kind of set the tone that everybody knew they were being watched, that there was another level of security that was taking place. And there are problems, and we need to be, as much as we prepare, problems can often emerge. Sometimes it's an off-message speaker, somebody who goes on and on and on and gets off the script. Someone's got to be in charge at the meeting to make sure that the off-script speakers are pulled back onto the script. I've seen, and I know other jurisdictions have seen a shouting match. You guys don't understand, and if you don't, and in one of the cases, it's been initiated by a very animated criminal justice system employee. They need to be brought back on message, and again, somebody has to be in charge. Not a surprise that there are times when offenders are inattentive, they're disruptive, they don't pay attention, and I've seen them hustled on out of the room. I've seen their mother turn to them. I was at a meeting in a church basement in St. Louis, and a young man was acting up and making jokes and talking when he wasn't supposed to, and his mother stood up and let him have one right across the head and said, "You better be quiet or you're going to prison." They're not playing. They're serious. That got everybody's attention. We didn't script or coach that mother, but it certainly was a powerful message. I've seen another call in where an offender's fallen asleep, and again, unscripted, impromptu, the prosecutor walked over next to the individual who was sleeping, put their hand on their shoulder, and woke them up and said, "If you're tired, we got plenty of jail cells for you. We'll be happy to run you downtown right now. You better pay attention." Well, not only did it get that individual's attention, everybody in the room sat up a little straighter. Everybody paid a little more attention. And then there are people at the Q&A time that will question the evidence and say, "What do you mean this works? You prove it. I can't believe it." Nobody would pay attention to the cops. Everybody knows the cops and the prosecutor aren't going to help us. Or everybody knows there's no jobs for us. Or everybody knows this is just a program to put more blacks or people of color in prison. So somebody and multiple somebodies need to be prepared to address individuals who will create problems, whether they're on the team or in the audience, who will challenge the findings. And I think we end at this point in the presentation by opening up to the audience for questions that the lieutenant and I could respond to, or things that at SPI Central, Vivian or Chip would be prepared to respond to. And thank you for your attention during the sometimes technical difficulties. Hello? Are there questions that we could respond to?
If anyone needs to unmute their line, you just need to press #6 on your phone to make sure it's unmuted. All right, sounds like we don't have any questions. Chip, are you still on the line? Do you want to close up the webinar?
I would be happy to do that.
Hang on.
Go ahead,
hang on.
Scott.
Can you hear me?
There he is.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I was muted. I would just ask Tom Woodmansee a long question. Tom, my question is, it seems that your agency has made a commitment to doing this, and I'm wondering if this is running off of a grant or if you're using internal resources, and if so, did this require a major shift in resources to pull this off?
Yeah, I anticipated that might be a question, Scott, and we made a commitment, and that to me is the most pivotal thing to start with, is the top of the agency head, if it's going to be driven by the law enforcement, which it most often is, from my understanding of these. It has to come from the chief, it has to come from the higher-ups, that this is the direction we're going. we started out with a 3-person or 4-person unit, myself and 3 detectives. Then we did receive a $700,000 grant, and so we were able to double the unit. And really, we are with that. We are doing so many presentations and so much education that we now are feeling after a few years that the department is really understanding what this is. So obstacles and really indoctrination of the program stem from, in my opinion, education of what it is, and also clear leadership direction of implementation. This is what we're going to do. And that can be often challenging, especially if people are not really comfortable with what this approach is.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Anybody else?
This is Tom again. Just know if anyone has any questions that they would like to forward me, please do so. I have a lot of materials on our setup, our program, and I'm happy to share them with anyone who's interested.
Scott, I think we have the contact.
That goes for me as well. Yes, Chip?
I think we have the contact information on one of the last slides, don't we?
There it is.
Okay.
It's where the additional resources are and where you can reach either Tom or myself via email. And, of course, you can always go to the SBI, the link, the first URL, which has a wealth of valuable resources.
Very good. Okay, so we've gone a little bit over time. I, too, want to thank everybody for staying on and for putting up with our technical issues here. So, Scott and Tom, thank you again. Excellent presentation. And I just want to thank Zoe, Vivian, and Chip Stewart back at CNA for all the work they put into this. Obviously, thank BJA for their support, and thank everybody for staying on the line today and for joining in. Please remember to complete your evaluation when it comes your way, and please remember that other webinars are recorded on our website, and since you're logged into us now, you'll be notified of upcoming webinars, which there will be a few after the first of the year. So thanks to everybody. Appreciate it.